Thank you so much for coming out today. I just want to have just a couple of thank yous before I begin. First, I want to thank the Chicago Humanities Festival for inviting me, and I want to thank Rick Livingston from the Ohio State Humanities Institute for his contribution. And I really, most of all, want to thank all of you for coming out today. There is something so genuinely exciting about the idea of a humanities festival, and it says so much about the intellectual depth of Chicago and this great city. So really what I want to do this afternoon is what I'd like to do is, see, how do I put this politely? I'd like to exploit you a little bit. Let me start with an act of historical imagination. When I say the phrase, the 60s, what image is it that comes immediately to mind? Is it maybe this one? The dashing young president on the night of his inauguration. Is it this one? The dogs of Birmingham. Is it this one? The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King on a sun-washed summer afternoon. Is it that one? Somewhere in the Vietnamese countryside? Or that one? Somewhere in the San Francisco countryside? Or maybe that one? Just a couple of miles south of here in front of the Conrad Hilton Hotel? Or that one? For some of you, it's clearly that one. And if by any chance those are the images that come to mind, or if by any chance images like that come to mind, that's not particularly surprising. Because more than almost any other decade, I think, in the 20th century, the 1960s has a kind of historical purchase. It's got a resonance for America, a historical resonance that's very, very strong. It's a story of profound political conflict that begins with the kind of liberal promise of the early 60s, passes through the radical challenges of the mid-60s, and then ends with a resurgent right. It's a decade of sweeping social change, of the birth of a counterculture, of feminism, of women's liberation, of gay rights, of gay liberation, of a sexual revolution. It's a decade of a bloody and brutal and deeply divisive war. And over the decades since the 1960s, historians have deepened this story in an awful lot of ways. We now have shelves of books on Black power, or on the rise of conservative politics, particularly in the late 1960s. There's libraries of books on different aspects of the Vietnam War. But they haven't fundamentally changed that story. The arc of the story remains very much the same. And there's a good reason for that. Because what happened in Washington, what happened in Birmingham, what happened along the Mekong River mattered. And the last thing I'm going to do today is say that it didn't. Instead, I have really a very simple goal. All I want to say is what happens to the story of the 1960s if we just happen to wander into one of those places that the standard story doesn't go. And if we spend a little time in one of those places just trying to see the 1960s from that perspective. What happens if we go to Eddy Street? I first came across this photo years ago in this book. This is a collection of photos that was published by the National Archives a long, long time ago. I swear my parents got it as part of the Book of the Month Club. And this photo is in the back, and this is the caption. It says, "Patriotic residents on the west side pose in front of their homes under a long line of American flags on the 4th of July, 1961, Chicago, Illinois. I was fascinated. But I wasn't fascinated enough to actually go beyond the photo for years, because I am essentially lazy. And then earlier this year, I decided I wanted to know more, and so I started to dig. This is the 6100 block of West Eddy Street in the northwest side of Chicago. It is the 4th of July, 1961, the first year that the folks on Eddy Street held a 4th of July celebration. 36 houses on the block, 38 flags. And when you look at the photo, your eye is immediately drawn to these two people. The man, because he's got that nice white shirt on, the woman, because she has got that great defiant look on her face. It's not supposed to be. You're supposed to be drawn to this man here. His name is Ed Cahill, and he organized the 4th of July event. And then if you're at all like me, what happens is your eye gets drawn up to those boys standing at attention up on the porch, and then it follows the flags down the block into what looks like the early morning sun. And by the time you've gotten to the back of the block, you've gone right over this group of people behind the hedge here. And particularly to her. That's Ed Cahill's wife, Stella. Another perspective, another story. The story starts a long time before the 1960s. It starts in a town and a village in what is today southern Poland. In the early days of the 20th century, when that part of Europe was swept up in a massive wave of industrialization, when the great power of the machine started hammering down from Warsaw and Łódź, coming into the small towns of that part of Poland, transforming economies, transforming communities, changing families, driving out the young. Two of the people who left those towns were Stella's parents. Her father in 1908, her mother in 1912. They didn't know each other in Poland. They met here in Chicago, where they came, presumably because it's a lot better to be in the center of the industrial world than on its ragged edges. They met in Chicago. They married on the 24th of June, 1914. The next year, they had their first child, a little boy, and the year after that, day after Christmas, 1916, they had Stella. After that, the family had 22 months together until Stella's father was killed by the great influenza epidemic that swept across the world in the aftermath of the Great War, leaving Stella's mother, a 22-year-old widow, with 2 children to raise on her own. Now that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And so within a year and a half, in early 1920, in January 1920, Stella's mother married again. Now I can't tell you what it was that led Stella's mother, to her new husband, another Polish immigrant, 6 years older than she was. But my guess is that one of the things she was looking for was the security that a marriage could provide. Hers didn't. The next time they showed up in the historical record in 1930 in the United States Census, Stella's stepfather and mother were living hard alongside the railroad tracks at 19th and Clark, a desolate stretch of industrial Chicago. Stella's stepfather was working as a common laborer in a furniture factory. His mother was working in the wrapping room of a candy factory. By then, Stella was 13, old enough to see the tensions that were running through her family, the strain running through that flat. Old enough to know that her family was not a happy one. Now, I don't know when in the 10 years after that Stella met Ed Cahill. In many ways, they were very similar. They were born only a couple months apart. Ed was also of immigrant stock. His father was the son of Irish immigrants. His mother was born and raised in Limerick. Ed also lost a parent to that influenza epidemic, his mother. His father almost immediately remarried, presumably because he didn't want to raise their 2 children, 2 boys, on his own. For much of the 1920s, I think, they lived on the eastern edge of Garfield Park. There's only one key difference between them, but it was a key difference. Stella's family was lodged in the lower end of the working class. Ed's family was at the upper end. His father was a foreman for a construction company that did work on city contracts, which I hear in Chicago is a good deal to get. And that little difference was enough so that in 1928, when Ed was 11 years old, his parents bought that house on Eddy Street, out in a district called the Dunning District. Any of you from Chicago? So you have a vague idea of what I'm talking about. It was a brand new area, brand new, tiny little classic Chicago bungalow. It was overwhelmingly a working class area. Foremen, craftsmen, factory hands working in the machine trade. Most of them native born. All of them white. Because Chicago had already instituted the racial segregation that made Chicago one of the most segregated cities in the country. Overwhelmingly Catholic, though there were a few Lutherans in there as well. A place so raw that when the Cahills went to Sunday Mass, as the Cahills did, their local parish didn't have a proper church. All they had, St. Ferdinand's, all they had was a little building that the parishioners had built just a couple of months before the Cahills moved out there. And that's where Ed Cahill spent his teenage years. I can tell you that Ed and Stella married in May of 1940, and they had their first child, a little girl, the next year. And then that family split apart, not permanently, but because of the war. Ed went into the military, served in Europe in the Signal Corps. Stella went back to her mother, with the baby this time, back now to Garfield Park. And then when the war was over, Ed came home, used the GI Bill to take a course in refrigeration, because we all think somehow that everyone used the GI Bill to go to college. Well, they didn't. The vast majority of them used them to get a trade. He went out and got a trade and got a job out of that trade in the vacuum can company. Though very quickly, he ended up in sales. They had a second child in 1947. They had a boy this time. And when he was born, they brought him home to that house on Eddy Street, Ed's father's house. Now, Ed and Stella's house, too. And it was still very much the kind of neighborhood it was when the Cahills moved there in the late 1920s. Still working class, still exclusively white. But it was starting to become more solid. The empty lots that had been there back in the 20s and early 30s were filling in. The string of shops out on the main streets filling in. But the main thing that was starting to happen all the way through the 1950s was this massive wave of institution building. The Lutherans, 1953, opened a new high school. And the Catholics went wild. Same year, the Christian Brothers moved their old high school from the center city, St. Patrick's, up into that neighborhood, only 3 or 4 blocks south of the Cahills. The Sisters of the Resurrection, a Polish order, opened a brand new hospital, 1956, just down the road. And that parish, St. Ferdinand's, in 1959, they opened a massive, gorgeous new church, big enough for a parish that now had swelled to 15,000 people. And the Cahills, Ed and Stella, their lives solidified too. I can't tell you how much Ed made. I wish I could. But I can tell you that in that neighborhood between 1950 and 1960, the median family income increased by 67%. That's in absolute terms for the economists among us. And there is no reason to think that the Cahills were lagging behind. They bought their first car, 1953. Hadn't had a car until 1953. But most of all, what the Cahills did was they used this sense of solidity to anchor themselves in those massive institutions that were being built around them. Of course, the Cahills went to the parish church every Sunday. When the kids were old enough, they went to the parish school. When their oldest daughter graduated from the parish school, they sent her to an all-girls school just down the block, Alvernia High. And when she graduated from there in 1960, they did the most extraordinary thing. They sent her on to DePaul so she could commute to college. Went to college in a place, in a neighborhood, where the average educational attainment for adults was 9 years, and she went to college. In this picture, the daughter, Judy, she's not in there because it's 1961 and she had a party to go to. But her brother is one of those young men up on the steps there. And the Cahills' third child, born in 1952, is kneeling next to her dad. Her mother, standing behind her, standing behind almost everyone, smiling for the camera. A 44-year-old mother of 3 at the dawn of the 1960s. Over the next 10 years, the signal events of the 1960s, the ones that immediately come to mind, swirled around Eddy Street. Take civil rights. In the cataclysmic summer of 1966, Martin Luther King brought the Southern Civil Rights Movement to Chicago, staged a whole series of protests against segregated housing, the most volatile of them at real estate agents' offices in white neighborhoods. One of those protests came with about a mile and a half south of the Eddy's house, of the Cahills' house on Eddy Street. About 700 whites came as counter-protesters, stood on the opposite side of the street. There was some jeering, racial epithets thrown, a couple of bottles, some arrests made. 1968, some of the parishioners at St. Ferdinand's picketed their own church because they were upset that their pastor supported the integration of public schools. They didn't have anything to worry about. 1960, there was one African American living in the Cahills neighborhood. 1970, there was one African American living in the Cahills neighborhood. Color line didn't budge an inch. And then there was Vietnam. I know that at least one, and maybe two, of the kids in the Cahills block served tours of duty in Vietnam during the rapid escalation of the mid-1960s. Ed was very proud of that because he continued this celebration all through the 1960s. Every 4th of July, they put those flags up. And in 66, he wrote to the Trib to say how proud he was that one of the kids was serving his country. And in his letter, he asked that we pray for his safety. But Vietnam played out in a really different way for the Cahills. Because it turned out that the vacuum can company that Ed worked for was a defense contractor. It made a particular item, a can, funny how that worked, that the military used. And so the company did really well with the war escalation, and Ed, now sales manager, undoubtedly received some of the benefits of that booming economy. Now, I'm not saying that it made the Cahills rich. It didn't. 1965, when their son graduated from high school at St. Patrick's, taught by those Christian brothers, when he decided that he wanted to go away to school to Notre Dame, they had to take out a second mortgage to pay his way. But they were secure and stable enough that in the autumn of 1965, their son went to South Bend instead of Saigon. But when the Cahills talk about their son's decision to go away to school in the autumn of 1965, Vietnam does not enter into that story. That story has a whole different dynamic. Turned out that his dad, Ed, didn't want his son to go away to school. He wanted him to go down to the Illinois Institute of Technology and learn to be an engineer, to commute to school the same way his older sister had commuted. And if any of you happen to be from working-class families, you know how this goes. But Stella said to her son, one of those things that I guess wasn't often said. What do you want? And he said he wanted to go to Notre Dame. And so Stella talked Ed into it. Now, in the great scheme of things, in the great history of the 1960s, this is a small move. They sent their son away to a Catholic school, an all-male Catholic school, 2 hours away, where he studied exactly the same thing he would have studied at the Illinois Institute of Technology. But for the Cahills, this was a critical moment. And it's not hard to realize why. Because Stella Cahill, his mother, grew up, came of age in a life defined by insecurity, by the most extraordinary sense of insecurity, by seeing her parents struggling just to make ends meet, by seeing the strains that that struggle causes, how hard it is to struggle just to get by, to pay the rent on a flat in a miserable part of town. That she knew as intimately as you can possibly know that if one thing went wrong, one catastrophic turn, and everything could unravel. Because, of course, she'd seen that. When the flu had come through her family. And what happens once can always happen again. But it didn't. Instead, as an adult, Stella lived a life completely wrapped in security, the security of having a husband who earned enough that she didn't have to go off to work in the wrapping room of a factory the way her mother had to. The security of knowing that there was a deed sitting in a drawer somewhere in that house that had her name on it. The security of those great, massive institutions that had enveloped her family and defined her children's lives. The security of flags on the 4th of July. And now, what was she doing in the autumn of 1965? She was giving her son a step out of that world. A small one, absolutely a small one, but a step that meant that he would no longer live at home. A step that meant that instead of being a factory worker or a salesman, like his father, he'd have a profession. She was giving him a step across the class divide. And there's the other 60s. Another story of the 1960s. Not a story of the great social movements, though of course those great social movements are profoundly important. Not a story of war, at least in the conventional sense. Not a story of sweeping social change. Certainly not a story of any sexual revolutions. But a different 1960s. A 1960s that connects backwards to the great dislocations of industrialization, the shattering of communities. Because that's what industrialization did across a huge swath of the globe. And then, half a century later, their reconstruction. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that Eddy Street was somehow just like the perfect recreation of a southern Polish village. Of course it wasn't. But what it did have, I'm utterly convinced, was a shape given to it by the values, the worldview, the perspective of that immigrant generation. A generation that saw its sense of security utterly broken apart and now recreated it with many of the self-same institutions that they had in Poland. And with that hospital, the self-same nuns. That was Stella's 1960s. But what the 1960s also marked was the beginning for the Cahills of the disillusion of that world. Not for Stella. Stella and Ed, they lived in that house on Eddy Street till the day Stella died. She died in 2005. Her funeral mass was said in the same church that she'd attended for 50 years at St. Ferdinand's. And then she was buried in the same cemetery where her father had been buried in that cataclysmic year of 1919. But by then, her children had long since settled out in the suburban ring in that great middle-class world that their parents had actually given them. And none of them wanted to move back to Eddy Street, back into the house that with their mother's passing was now theirs. And so the following year, 2006, they sold that house. The first time that anyone but the Cahills had owned it, severing their last connection with Eddy Street. Now, that's just one family story. My guess is that if you shift the perspective just a little bit, shift it over to, I don't know, this man. Maybe there's an entirely different story there. Maybe there's a story there about the fundamental effects of changing family dynamics. Maybe there's a story there about the fundamental transformations of, I don't know, technological change. Shift the focus even more. Move down, say, into the very neighborhood that both the Cahills and Stella's family left down into Garfield Park. And maybe the story changes completely again. Then maybe all of a sudden that story becomes centered more on the profound effects of the segregation that so defined Eddy Street. The great burdens that race places in American society. I don't know. I have no way of knowing what other stories are out there, what other 60s exist, but that's my point. That what we need to do, what I think is so extraordinarily exciting, is the possibility of finding those stories, of moving beyond what we know was the 1960s, to move into all sorts of different parts of this city, of this nation, to rewrite our history. And that's not to say that the great stories we know don't matter, because of course they do. But if there's one thing I do believe more than anything else, it's that those small stories matter too. That the stories, like the stories of Cahills, like the stories of Eddy Street, that's the stuff of history too. So what I would love to do with the time I have remaining with you is simply to ask you, what are your stories of the 1960s? Thank you very much for coming out today.
Okay, we're now going to have a question and answer session, and we will try to fit in as many questions as possible. So if you raise your hands and let us know, we have a person on the other side of the aisle that's going to take questions on that side, and I'll be taking questions on this side. So please raise your hands high so we know where you are, and we'll try to fit in as many as possible. Please state your name and your question quickly without preface. Your name, sir.
My name's Tim Garner, and my question is if you could give us an update on what happened to the father, Mr. Cahill, and also what does Eddy Street look like today? Is it still, and so forth?
That's a wonderful question, thank you. Ed Cahill stayed with his company throughout his entire career. He retired from the company. Eventually, he was most proud, I must say, of the 4th of July celebrations. This was his great cause. More so than Stella. Stella, I get the impression, at times found this really quite annoying, particularly when Ed had a very bad tendency, apparently, to wash flags in her washing machine, which he did not appreciate. And then, as I mentioned, they stayed in the house. He finished as far as I know, the last years of his life where he was in hospice care. And Eddy Street, quite frankly, is anyone from Eddy Street? What are the chances of that, really? Looks a lot like it does today, actually. It's still overwhelmingly white. The educational attainment's is higher. There's certainly a higher level of college graduates, though that's hardly unusual. It's still very much an ethnic neighborhood. In fact, there's a higher percentage now of people not native-born living on Eddy Street and there is a somewhat higher Hispanic population as well. But it's still very, very much like it was.
Okay, we have a question on the other side.
Hi, my name's Noel Hertz.
Hi.
And I'm wondering, when you gave us the pictures to look at, or wondering where we were, the picture that's in my mind for the 60s is John F. Kennedy dead. Mm-hmm. And that is the single most important event in my memory.
Yeah.
That it's there all the time.
I think that's a great point, and I think it I'm going to use it, if you don't mind, to make a somewhat larger point of it, which, of course, now I've undermined the effectiveness of by telling you I'm about to do that. I really deeply believe, and I hope that this comes across, that I am not in any sense trying to displace those major events. And I think you're absolutely right that for many, many, many Americans of a certain generation, John Kennedy's assassination is very much a touch point. And I think it would have been a terrific idea, actually, to have put up, I would have used, now that you say that, I think I would have used the famous photo of his son saluting the flag. And that easily could have fit into, I think, the standard story we have. And I suspect, though it never has occurred to me to ask, that if I talked to the Cahills, they would think of that as a fundamentally important event, too. So I think you're right, that in many ways, ordinary people's lives intersect with those grand events in very important ways. In the same way that for me, 9/11, very much. I can tell you just minute by minute, but hour by hour, where I was when that happened. I remember driving to my children's school. They were in kindergarten and second grade to make sure they were safe in rural Massachusetts. I don't know what I would, but I think a lot of us felt that. So we intersect with events in these really profoundly personal ways. But I think the other side of the story is that our lives are shaped in so many ways by things that seem to fly under the radar of an historical narrative, but I think are profoundly important too.
Okay, we have a question on this side.
Oh,
Your name,
sorry.
please.
Dr. Boyle, the description for this lecture said that you were going to indicate how this other world still affects our world today, and I don't think you got to that. I mean, I grew up in a community very much like this. I left the nest to go to Northwestern. We sold my mom's house for the first time last year, et cetera, et cetera. But myself and the other children of this community more or less formed what we now call Blue America, right? And are
Yeah.
you saying that out of this experience also came Red State America, and if so, how?
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, you have just pointed out what I was desperately trying to hide, which was that my description of the talk didn't match the talk I was giving. And that's because sometimes you write those descriptions before you write the talk. I was not supposed to admit that. Oh, well. Here's what I think is more important. I don't know, and I don't think we want to, I don't think I want to, directly link this story, this particular story, to a particular political outcome. I think what's more important is the larger transformations that I think are very much embedded in many, many Americans' experience. And I think that that's really the critical thing. That what I'm trying to describe here is not everyone's experience, certainly. I suspect in this room there are hundreds and hundreds of different experiences. But when you said, and I really appreciated that this is very much your experience too, you made my day. Because I think it's a lot of people's experience, and what it's really an experience of is the profound transformation of American society in the 1950s and 1960s that I think we underestimate. Which is that the 1950s and the 1960s, in a lot of ways, it turned out, I might be wrong about this in the long run, I hope I am, were anomalous in that they provided ordinary people with a striking level of social mobility. That it became possible for an awful lot of ordinary people from ordinary circumstances to gain for themselves, first, that sense of security, which I don't think you can underestimate. When you grow up with a kind of profound fear that insecurity creates, to then suddenly be living in a place where you don't have that anymore, that's incredible. And then what the Cahill story does, and it sounds like your story does too, is it's the moment when people start to move their children up to across that class divide. My great fear, and this is to bring it to the current day, is that that's become harder to do. That it's become harder for ordinary people. It's not impossible, but it's become harder for ordinary people to move their children up that ladder the way that they could in the Cahills. Now, there were costs to that. I can only imagine how hard it must have been for the Cahills to see their kids disappear. I'm sure they would have loved them to move into the house next door. I have a funny feeling that may be true in your family, too. But there was that moment of social mobility, and then I think something happens. There's transformations in the economy, those larger structures of society that have made that harder for the next generation. Not impossible, but harder. I'll give you I teach at Ohio State. And I'm just going to tell you this, just for any future questions coming up. I'm really very, very pleased that my dean is here, which means my boss is here. So if any of you have complaints, just keep them to yourself.
Hi,
No, I'm just kidding. Just bring them up after.
hi,
An institution like Ohio State, what our job is really is to provide avenues for that social mobility. And I think even there it's becoming harder because it's more expensive, because it's harder for kids to find and families to afford that. It's a tougher world in some ways. And I think that's a critical story that does connect the Cahills up to a larger narrative that maybe transcends political boundaries. It's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, do we have a question on the other
We have
side?
a question way down
yes.
here.
If
Whoops.
Oh,
Sorry.
oh, that's sorry.
I'm sorry.
If the Cahills had lived on the south side or a west side, where there was a pattern of blockbusting and families selling their house, moving a mile west, maybe 2 miles west, can you speculate how that might have affected their attitudes and made them different from the attitudes of the Cahills on Eddy?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. I will say this as a first step to answering your question, and it's a great question. I really, really appreciate that very much. The Cahills did live on the west side. In the 1920s, the Cahills lived on the eastern end of Garfield Park. And Stella's family, in 1940, which is the last time I found her parents, her stepfather and father, they were living also on the eastern end of Garfield Park. So there well may be exactly the story that you're describing in the Cahills family, and I just don't know that yet. Because this research you're getting some brand new stuff here. So there may be that story. But your larger point, which I think is really a wonderful one, is that the process of racial change in places like the West Side, Chicago, and in cities across the country was absolutely a wrenching and brutal process. I've written about that in Detroit, that process in Detroit, which happens to be my hometown. And it is one of the great scarring stories of the modern American experience. Because what it does is it cuts to the great fault line in American society, which is the fault line of race. And it's intimately connected with that sense of security. Because what makes the northern racial system, the system of Chicago or Detroit or Cleveland, so incredibly powerful is that it linked together race and the power of the real estate marketplace. And that's what drove so much of the processes you just described, of blockbusting, of white flight, of racial conflict in the neighborhoods. And it has left an enormous scar in American cities that I think we, both as a society and certainly as scholars, really don't grapple with because we kind of stay away from that issue. So whether it would have changed the Cahills, I don't really know. It may well have been part of the Cahills' history. But it is certainly part of the collective history of America's cities in exactly this period. It is telling that group of parishioners picketed their own parish. I mean, it's one thing to picket someone else's parish, but your own parish? I mean, that really tells you how deep that racial fear ran in a neighborhood that really, as far as I could tell, had nothing to fear about racial change because it wasn't coming. That's a wonderful question. Thank you.
We have a question on this side.
We're going to get there, I promise.
My name is Judith Barnard. I'm puzzled by why you chose this story, and I just want to clarify. Are you saying the Cahills were emblematic of the 60s? And if so, is there any overarching theme of the 60s that goes beyond them?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'll give you, there are 3 parts that I'll try to answer them. I literally chose the Cahills because I loved this photo. It is literally no source whatsoever, except I was fixated on that photo and I wanted to know more. And they became my entry point. So there was nothing scientific or systematic in this. It was a purely personal choice. Purely a choice of interest. I don't think they're emblematic of the 1960s, because what I'm really trying to suggest is that we don't need an emblematic story of the decade. What we need are multiple stories of the decades, a way to move past what we think we know of the decade. Of all decades in America, in the 20th century American experience, I think most of us have a sense we know the 60s better than any other decade. I teach a course on the 1960s, an undergraduate course of the 1960s, and I know that it fills up because the kids say, ooh, the 60s, there's going to be Jimi Hendrix, and there's going to be some hippies, and it fills a gen ed requirement. And what I'm trying to suggest is, because we think we know that history, we're not seeing other stories. Your third point, I think, is really my main one. But I do think, and it comes back, sir, to your question from a couple of minutes ago, but I do think that the Cahills story does open up one, it's not the only one, but one important story of the 1960s, which is really a story, not of social conflict, but of two dynamics: security and social mobility. That what the story of really the 50s and 60s really is through the Cahills is it's a bridge between two Americas. That immigrant America, rooted in the working class, and the middle class America that I suspect so many of us in this room are members of. It's that bridge. It's the moment when families, not every family, but more than the Cahills, started to cross that bridge. And I think that's a really important story. I think it comes very close to I like to think, it comes close to an awful lot of people's experience. But I suspect there's a lot of other stories, too, out there that will follow a very different dynamic than that.
Okay, I think we have a question down in the front.
We made it.
We did. My name is Alvin Green. I grew up in Chicago, east of where you're talking about, but similar experience. I find the story fascinating. What I'm wondering about is if you went into the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, 50s, wouldn't you find similar stories of upward mobility and the type of exploration that you've found?
I think you would find some. Sure, thank you. Certainly. I think you would find some. But I think that the 50s and 60s in particular is a real acceleration of that. I think the 30s in particular, there was, because of obviously the great economic collapse of the 1930s, that a lot of families who had started down that path, and that's the Cahill story, right? They just start down the path, it's abruptly stopped. And it's on hold for a full 15 years. From 1930, because the Depression lasts throughout the 1930s, the unemployment rate in the United States in 1940 is 14%. Now that's a lot better than it was in 1932 when it was 25%, but 14% is still a bit on the high side. And then immediately the war comes in with a massive disruption in the war. 15 million men served in World War II. Massive disruption. And then it's only, I think, in the late 40s and through into the 50s and 60s that the dynamic that just is starting to put into place in the 20s really accelerates. I also think, and I'll add this on, that in those intervening 15 years, some really critical things had changed. I'll cite just one that I'm particularly fond of, though it doesn't affect the Cahill story: unionization. What did it mean for industrial workers, not people up in the upper end of the working class, because they were going to be in pretty solid ground, but for factory workers, to suddenly have union wages, to suddenly have a retirement plan, to have a health care plan. We forget that prior to the 1930s, the vast majority of people in America, they didn't have health care plans. Now suddenly in the 50s and 60s, they had that. You had paid vacation. These guys, this area, this was the metal trades. So we're talking about some small shops, we're talking about machinists, and suddenly people who never in their wildest dreams could have imagined that they were going to have a health plan, a retirement plan, Social Security. I think one of the things, and I know you're not really raising this question, but this is a classic speaker's trick. You didn't ask this, but I'm just going to go and talk about it anyways, because somehow you won't notice that I'm just changing the subject. I think to an extraordinary degree, historians at least, we forget how profound getting a Social Security check every month was. And that, of course, expanded in the 1950s. And a lot of Americans didn't get Social Security checks even after Social Security came in. But the coverage was expanded in the 1950s. How profound it was, if you're in the middle class, how profound it was for ordinary people to know that if their mom or their wife got sick, all wasn't lost. They're such small things. They're not small things at all. That's the transformation of people's lives. And a lot of that really kicks in for an awful lot of people after World War II. GI benefits. You can go off and get a course in refrigeration, and that's going to launch you. I went to see, now I am really going to riff on this, so thank you for getting that question, and I'm ignoring it now. My wife and I, since we were visiting Chicago, we went to the theater last night. We went to Steppenwolf. Thank you. I've never been applauded before for going to the theater, but that's nice of you. And they have this great play they're mounting called Good People. Have anyone seen it? In fact, now I'm really riffing. That, in fact, is the connection. Because what's that play about? It's about those tiny little things, right, that veer you off in a different direction. But it's also about the dilemmas of the modern day, where an awful lot of people aren't going to get that chance. And I think that really is where think of the Cahill story, in my mind, as the end point of this long history from the turn of the century forward, and good people of what, for a huge portion of today's population, we have now become.
Okay, we've come to the end of our Q&A. Could we please give a big hand to Professor
Thank you
Boyle?
so much.